I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 99. One away from 100.
Yay!
Yeah, I don't know what it is about 100. I'm going to have to find some sound effects, aren't I, for next week.
Fireworks, celebratory clapping, cheering.
Yeah, I'll just layer them all on.
There you go.
But here we go. And this week it is Terri's turn to share something. What have you got for us today, Terri?
Well, Daisy, I actually went to a new podcast. Well, it's not a new podcast, but a new podcast to me. And it's called the Dhru Purohit Podcast. He has interviewed all the same people that we listen to on all of our favorites. So I had to look him up because I really didn't know anything about him. He is a podcast host, a serial entrepreneur, and an investor in the health and wellness industry. He has a Ultra Wellness Center, which is a clinic based in Massachusetts and specializes in treating chronic disease through personalized medication. So he is not a physician, but he is obviously someone who is invested in and can start a clinic. And he's also contributed to 2 books, one being Clean Gut and Clean Eats. So very focused on health, maybe a little different than traditional health, a lot about brain health. A lot of his guests talk about monitoring your glucose, understanding the effects of sugar. So this episode is number 81, and it's, are you a chronic people pleaser? Do these 3 things. So I thought this was an interesting topic that a lot of people might benefit from thinking about and maybe approaching things a little differently. So this was a self topic. He did not have a guest on this, so it was just a topic that's very near and dear to him. And he shared his own experiences with it and things that he has learned about it. So in general, just defining people pleasing or people pleaser is a person who has emotional need to please others at the expense of their own needs or desire. And that's the really important part. Pleasing other people is not a bad thing. It becomes problematic when it interferes with you actualizing your own needs or desires.
It's a Gretchen Rubin obliger. I always think of it as an obliger.
Absolutely. And probably obliger to the nth degree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we talked about, just the idea that if you're stuck in a pattern of chronic people pleasing, it probably means that you're not fully actualizing the things in your life that you're seeking. You're not reaching your goals. You might be avoiding opportunities, taking fewer risks, because you're putting the priority of others first rather than prioritizing yourself.
Yeah, that's absolutely your default position, isn't it? Putting other people before yourself.
So one of the things he encouraged people to think about, just, am I a people pleaser, or am I a people pleaser to the degree where it's, getting in the way for me, is to really kind of explore, what are you missing out on? What are the things that you're doing as far as people pleasing? What might that be holding you back from doing? And he shared an article from Psychology Today. And I have mixed experiences with Psychology Today. At first, I used to think, this is just like a pop culture thing. But they actually have really good articles. And when I was a psychologist, we had a copy of it in the waiting room. And my clients would get the most interesting things from it that they could apply. So it actually is, I think, a great resource. But this article is called 10 Signs You're a People Pleaser. And so things that I think people might want to kind of recognize as people-pleasing behaviors. And obviously, if you kind of score on a test of you get 10 out of 10 on this, that probably means you're doing a lot of people-pleasing. So the first one would be you pretend to agree with everyone. Now, that doesn't just mean listening politely and, nodding when people are talking, but actually when you pretend that you agree because of the fear of being liked or the fear of not being liked and the fear maybe of ruffling feathers. So you pretend to agree with everyone. Number 2, you feel responsible for how other people feel. So maybe thinking that I need to make this person happy. I need to not get this person upset, that you are in control of managing other people's emotions. Number 3, you apologize often, to the point where it's almost like you're apologizing for everything you do. You say something, oh, I'm sorry, and you move in front of someone and you're apologizing. Doesn't mean that apologizing is a bad thing, but when you're apologizing just kind of for how you exist, that is a definite sign of people pleasing. Number 4 is you feel burdened by the things you have to do. Oftentimes, people who do too much people pleasing don't have time to do their own things because they don't say no to things, which is number 5. You have a hard time saying no. You take on things that aren't yours to do because you don't want to say no. Number 6, you feel uncomfortable if someone is angry at you. And number 7, you act like the people around you. So you do things and act in certain ways to blend in and fit in rather than acting in ways that are congruent with your own style and your own beliefs. On that one, it's interesting. Studies show that people pleasers engage in self-destructive behavior if they think it will help others feel more comfortable in social situations. So you can see people, end up kind of harming themselves by doing a lot of people pleasing. Number 8, you need praise to feel good. Otherwise, you don't recognize your value. Number 9, you go to great lengths to avoid conflict. And number 10, you don't admit when your feelings are hurt because that would risk upsetting the other person or making them feel uncomfortable. So as I'm reading through this, I'm guessing most people listening could say yes to 10 of 10 at least some of the time, and some of them quite a bit of the time. So I think it's important just to kind of go over that list, first of all. So some people might think, why in the heck do we do this people-pleasing behavior? Where does this come from? And in this podcast, he actually brought out an article, kind of an anthropological way of looking at it. I did not go back and read the article. As soon as I pulled it up, it was like old copy that was kind of blurry. I'm like, oh, I'm not going to do that. But I love this concept, and I think it helps explain some things. So one reason that people please is because of the fear or the threat of being ostracized. So for humans and for many animal groups, cooperation and fitting in is essential for survival. So uniformity is everyone acting according to what the group needs. And this uniformity is really important. And when you go outside of those bounds, you risk being ostracized. You risk being cast out of that group. And again, especially if you think of us as humans, thousands and thousands of years ago, if you got ousted out of your tribe, you probably weren't going to make it. Mm-hmm. Protection-wise, food-wise, resource-wise, you just probably weren't going to survive. So when the uniformity breaks down, the group practices ostracism. They take that person, that animal, depending on if you're talking humans or animals, and will put them on the outs. And that this is deeply woven into our fabric of people-pleasing. And he went through some examples, and I thought this one was pretty fascinating. There's one example of a hunter-gatherer society in which if you murdered someone in the tribe, not only would you be ostracized and cast out, but for 6 generations, your family would be kept out of membership.
Blimey.
So it's definitely very threatening to continuing, your lineage to be ostracized, to break the norm, to not people please, to not conform with things. Groups have different ways of communicating the stages of getting kicked out. You might be scolded, warned. You might lose some privileges or some opportunities, kind of telling you need to bring that behavior back in line. And if you didn't deeply apologize, make amends, then you would be ousted by the group. So again, here's where the people pleasing comes in. I'm on my way out. I have to stay in. So I'm going to apologize. I'm going to ingratiate myself, go overboard. Again, a lot of people pleasing just for survival's sake. So then Dhru talked about, why do we keep these problematic behaviors alive? It makes sense that we do it sometimes. There are probably times when it's really important to, might be a safety thing for us. But why do we keep the patterns alive? And he talked about this. I don't think he used the phrase, but this is something I used to like to talk about a lot in therapy with clients. He said that it would be really important to think about what is in it for us. How do we benefit by continuing this pattern? By doing this behavior, what benefits do we get? Because on the surface, it looks like we get really no benefits. We've got no time. We're having to do things we don't want to do. We're having to ingratiate ourselves to people even though we don't agree with them. That all sounds horrible. Why do we keep doing it? I think of this as a concept of secondary gains. I think you and I may have talked about this before. The idea that on the surface, what you get from it sounds kind of bad, but underneath, it helps you in some way. So for example, the old child behavior analogy where a kid is acting out and the kid gets in trouble. And so you would think that's a really, nonsensical pattern for that kid to keep going with because they're getting into trouble. But the secondary gain is someone's paying attention to them. So they're willing to go through something uncomfortable to get this other need met. So Dhru really encourages people, when you think about your people-pleasing behaviors, to think about, how am I benefiting from this? What purpose is this serving for me? And he used the example of not saying no to people. So in order to be liked in the short term, the fear of people not liking me in every interaction, the fear is I'm going to be alone. So not saying no protects me from that. I feel like no matter what, I'm going to be accepted. I might be miserable with what I'm having to do, but I will be accepted. It also might be giving you an illusion that you can handle it all. And this allows you to preserve the ego, that you can handle everything. It reinforces for many of us a pattern of perfectionism. If I don't say no, if I don't say, I can't take on that task, are we risking not appearing like we can do everything? And does that feel threatening to us? And so again, we're choosing a pattern to protect our ego, to protect our image to other people, and even our image to ourselves. We don't want to think of ourselves maybe as someone who can't handle things. That would feel too threatening. So we just say yes and we take it on because maybe we grew up learning that we had to do everything ourselves. And now we keep that pattern alive by not asking for help, by agreeing to do everything. He talked about in his own life, he realized that it was reinforcing a pattern that no one is there to help you. That was kind of the message he learned growing up. So you have to do everything yourself. And people-pleasing kind of helped him preserve that illusion that he's on his own and that he didn't fit in. And so it was a survival technique and that he had to keep fighting to fit in. That idea kind of it's me against the world. So I don't get my hopes up, so then I can't be let down. If I don't ask for help, if I don't say no, if I keep portraying that I can handle everything, I don't have to find out that I'm going to be let down by people.
Yes, I was going to say, I wondered if there's, to a certain extent, when I think about, when you're going down through the list, and I know, there's a degree of how much you say yes to each one on the list, and then how many of the list that apply and things like that. But I was thinking of the kind of learned behavior instead of the more sort of ingratiating, people-pleasing side is the learning how to cope with that by self-isolating. So turning yourself into a bit of a loner, becoming self-sufficient, becoming more independent. Well, F you with your groups that I, need to conform to. I'm going to be self-sufficient here on the outside. I don't need to fit in. And you purposefully distance yourself. You move yourself to another country.
I was just going to say, and Daisy, I think you and I both may have enacted some of that in our adulthood.
You kind of give yourself a reason, or in some ways, I guess you give others the reason to be treating you with a bit more distance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
By literally creating distance.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. This is in my notes later, but it fits really well here. He shared a quote by someone named Jerry Colonna, who he really appreciated this quote. And it is, "How am I complicit in creating the conditions that I say I don't want?"
Mm-hmm.
I think this really touches on what you're describing. It feels too threatening to be isolated or not accepted. And so I will set that up myself.
Because it takes the question mark out of that.
Sure.
You know, if you make it so that you can't be, as an example, if you make it so that it's very difficult to invite you to something because you've purposefully distanced yourself, then you're not going to be upset when you don't get invited to something.
Right. It puts the power, I think, in your hands. I'm choosing to not be invited. That feels less hard to accept than I wasn't invited. And then just this goes along with the idea that people treat us how we teach them to treat us. And exploring this can really help you find ways that you can reset your expectations and not have to maybe do as much people pleasing. And in this example that we're talking about, maybe take some risks to connect, not isolate. We talked about the example of one of the signs of people pleasing that you don't admit when your feelings are hurt. How does this benefit you? Well, maybe it's that you get to avoid feeling vulnerable or weak. If I don't acknowledge my feelings are hurt, I'm pretending that I'm impenetrable, that they cannot make me feel bad. I cannot be hurt. And that helps us maybe feel like we aren't vulnerable. We want everything to appear okay to others and maybe even to ourselves because it's too threatening otherwise. And again, worried about ruffling feathers. So we would rather just sit with the fact that our feelings have been trampled on, but not express that out of fear of ruffling feathers with the other people. Apologizing too often, how might that be benefiting you? Clearly, you don't risk offending people. You're apologizing, you're, again, ingratiating yourself. It's that idea almost expressing like you don't want to be too much, that asking for what you want is not something that you deserve or that your needs are not justified. And I think for us, when we do this generally goes way back, early learning. If our needs were not met, we learned that our needs were unnecessary, that we were on our own with them, and that we had no right to ask for them to be met, or even if we did, they weren't going to be met anyway. So this, again, I think gets a lot of people-pleasing behaviors going. And the taking responsibility for how others feel, I think, is a really big thing. I hear this a lot in my work and even in my social relationships, but working to understand that other people have their right to their reaction, just like you have the right to express your needs or your feelings. And we get afraid maybe of people expressing feelings that are difficult and maybe even feeling like we are a burden if their response to us makes them uncomfortable. And instead working to see that's their response, that's their set of feelings. They can handle that. I'm not responsible for handling it. I think is really big. In this part of the discussion, he said something that really stood out to me, even less about people pleasing and just about us as people. Confidence is going through a situation and knowing that regardless of how it turns out, you will be okay. So the podcast episode kind of ends there with just a lot of discussion around all this. But the idea that really looking at how are these behaviors serving me and how are they no longer serving me in ways that I want them to, so that we can start confronting them and start practicing saying no. Start practicing saying no to small things before you say it to the bigger things that feel riskier. Start sharing your feelings.
Yeah, don't go straight in with the really difficult one. Practice it on the things that hardly impact you, really, that feel quite easy.
And with people that feel safer. Before you start practicing it with things that feel a little more risky for you. Practicing saying no. Practicing letting people have their reactions. practicing sharing your own reactions, just breaking out of the pattern of feeling trapped in those people-pleasing modes. Because, again, they tend to hold us back. And although they're socially acceptable in many ways, they come at a great cost to us doing the behavior. So I just thought it was an interesting topic to think about and for people to maybe invite themselves to dig in a little bit. Why am I doing this behavior? What needs am I having met at the secondary gains level? Even though I don't like having to do this task I agreed to, how did it benefit me? And is there another way I can meet that need?
Well, I think a huge one that came to my mind with the people pleasing, and it's, almost stereotypical really, and more often than not is a woman, and it's that quite often the woman in the mother role, and that, doing everything for every member of their family, for their partner. Frankly, I might be jumping to conclusions here, but usually when we're talking about a husband, so we're talking, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it strikes me that it happens more in that kind of dynamic, and the children, and the feeling that comes out from it is the one of the benefit that you're getting from it is the feeling needed. My family would fall apart without me. They wouldn't know where their gym kit was. They wouldn't know where this was. It would fall apart. It wouldn't function well without me. And quite often, that physically is the case. But the benefit they get from that, even on the one hand, they get the boost from feeling that and knowing that, but on the other hand are feeling undervalued and underappreciated because everybody takes them for granted and doesn't show that appreciation and that thanks, apart from, maybe once a year on Mother's Day or something like that. But I'd say that's probably a very common one.
Yep. And so again, maybe looking at how can I help change this dynamic? I can still be needed. I can still help my family. How can I activate and initiate some areas where they can be more self-sufficient and more helpful and even help me with my needs? But again, you can hear already that starts to shake that foundation of this is how I know I'm important and needed.
Yes, because what happens then if you teach them to be more self-sufficient, but then they don't need you, then they don't come to you for the things. So yes, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? But yes, and the other thing that jumped to mind when you were just talking about the fitting in, and I keep coming back, it obviously stuck with me quite a lot, was Dr. Pippa Grange talking about this exchange being the primary word that you use with the dynamic with you and a group that you're fitting in with. The power of exchange. It should be about exchange. It's about what you give as much as you get, and vice versa. And it's not even necessarily thinking about what you have to give, but just appreciating that whatever you come with, whatever you give is of value. Sort of thinking at it that way rather than thinking about, oh goodness, what value am I going to offer? No, just you being part of that group, there's an exchange and there's value you're giving as well as what you're getting the other way.
And again, going back to the whole ostracism thing, that maybe without recognizing the value that you bring, the fear is I'm not bringing enough, therefore I'll be left out. And so I think having to keep moving away from that kind of ancestral approach and really be acknowledging we are included because we bring something, just like we include people because they bring something, and valuing that exchange without questioning it, I think is important idea here.
And also the importance of looking after yourself. I wrote down selfless versus selfish. Sometimes you feel, if you have this kind of mindset, that you're selfish if you're not selfless. if you're not looking after other people first. If you ever put yourself first, then you're being selfish.
Yeah.
But actually, and obviously there are degrees of it, but it is important to put at least some of your own needs first, even if you're thinking about just being in a healthy enough state physically and emotionally to continue benefiting others. At some points, you have to put yourself first to be able to give of yourself. Absolutely.
And I always used to talk about that as self-care, seeing it as self-care versus selfishness. Selfishness is looking out for yourself at the expense of others. Self-care is taking care of your needs, and then you're even more able to be present and connected with other people. Well, I think that's very interesting. And I think it's definitely a subject that as soon as you mentioned it, I thought, well, yes, I can immediately think of all sorts of people whose ears are going to be pricking up at the mention of the topic.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are all sorts of people who are that's going to be giving them lots to think about. So thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. I hope everyone listening can think about their people-pleasing behaviors, and are they serving them well? Or is there a different balance they want to strike? Learning to say no more often, learning to share when their feelings are hurt, letting other people take care of their own feelings. All of these things are balances that many of us could probably work on and benefit from doing so. Absolutely. And I shall ponder as we head out of this episode. I just gave into my very persistent French bulldog getting up on my lap how much of a dog pleaser I am. I was just going to say, Daisy, there's a complete difference between people pleasing and dog pleasing. Come on now.
Of course.
All right, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.
Have a great week.
You're in a bit.